This morning's scripture reading comes from the book of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 2. It's Matthew, chapter 24, verse 2. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily, I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down.
Psalm 8 addresses the Lord, saying, Out of the mouths of babes and nursing infants you have ordained praise. I often think of that when I think of times like Vacation Bible School. I was only able to be here 2 nights for it this past week because of some previous engagements with the gospel meeting in Parkersburg. But what I see is always the same. There's excitement and there is joy in the children when they get to learn about God. So many don't get to learn about God in our world. There is always joy when they get to learn about God, and specifically about creation. I love to try to build off of that sort of thing, and I want to call your attention to something this morning. The material that we used for the Vacation Bible School last week was from Apologetics Press. You can go to apologeticspress.org. In the bulletin, there's one small mistake. It's apologeticspress.com, but it's really apologeticspress.org. And you can find all kinds of things there for kids, all kinds of things there for adults, all kinds of things for everywhere in between. Not only written materials, but video materials. They also have an app for your phone that you could get on an Android at the Google Play Store. You could get on your iPhone at the App Store. The logo for it will look like that which is on your left. They have series of videos that are 5-6 minutes long, so they're not taxing to the attention span, that deal with different questions that people might have about creation that you might face out in the world. I find that the things that are made for kids are the things that I enjoy most, probably because that's where I am. But then they have also things for the evidence of Jesus as the divine Son of God, and then they have just a slew of other topics relating to evolution, relating to false religions, and relating to the truth of the Lord's New Testament church. You'll enjoy that. And it could be a building block for study for you, for friends around you. It could be an evangelism tool. If somebody has questions, they don't want to sit down for a study, which I find it to be more and more true, show them this. They can browse through it on their phone at their own leisure. This is Jerusalem. This is the area surrounding Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the subject of our study last week from a historical perspective as to why it is always in the news, and always has been in the news, if you will. It's at the center of a passageway between north and south, with the Mediterranean Sea to the west. Over to the east is the desert area, Arabia, as Paul said he went to in Galatians chapter 1. And Jerusalem has had a lot of history through the years. This morning, I want to ask these 2 questions. What were the signs of the destruction of Jerusalem that would take place in AD 70? Our time frame that we often consider in the sermons and in the Bible classes here is about AD 30 or 27 up through about AD 70 and maybe up to 100. We consider that time frame because that's when Christianity began. So we're concerned with that time frame regarding the history of the world. There's a lot about the history of the world that is preserved surrounding Jerusalem at that time, even though there's not a lot of other history about the world preserved at that time. Well, why does it matter? Were there going to be signs that Jerusalem would be destroyed? And then if there were, what do I care about it? Why does it matter to me? It's already happened. Well, we see Jerusalem in the news today. Jerusalem was destroyed at AD 70. It was rebuilt into what is now a place where the Dome of the Rock sits where the temple was. There's a Muslim quarter, a Christian quarter, an Armenian quarter, and another quarter that's not coming, the Jewish quarter. And we have all of this information, but what happened back then and why does it matter to me? I hope to make this easy to follow. I only have 3 scriptures to which I'd like you to turn. First of all, if you would please, Joshua chapter 23, verses 14 through 16. Joshua chapter 23, the last 3 verses of that chapter. Either follow along or listen carefully if you would. This is Joshua after he had brought the people of Israel into the land of Canaan and taken that land where Jerusalem was, and after he had brought them in and got them settled there in about 1500 BC, he's giving them his farewell address. He's reminding them of some things that God had said to them. Here's what he says starting in verse 14. He talks about his own death. Behold, this day I am going the way of all the earth, and you will know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one thing has failed of all the good things which the Lord your God spoke concerning you. All have come to pass for you, not one word of them has failed. That ought to do away with modern doctrines that say that God still owes Jerusalem and still owes Israel something. He's paid them all his debt. Now verse 15. Therefore it shall come to pass that as all the good things have come upon you, which the Lord your God promised you, so the Lord will bring upon you all harmful things until he has destroyed you from this good land which the Lord God has given you. Well, why would God destroy them from that land? Verse 16. When you have transgressed the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and have gone and served other gods and bowed down to them, then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you shall perish quickly from the good land which he has given you. When you stop worshiping me and honoring me for giving you this land, then I'll stop giving you the land, God says. Now the second passage is this. In 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 15, whereas in the first passage we see how they quickly would go from chosen to rejected, here this passage tells us about the destruction of Jerusalem that took place in 586 BC, how they were rejected, but with a temporary reprieve. You see, Jeremiah had said back in Jeremiah 29 that the people of Judah would be in captivity for 70 years. There was a relation to how many years they had been in captivity without letting the land rest. They're supposed to let the land rest every 7 years. Well, they'd gone through so many cycles that the amount the land didn't rest was 70 years, and God was going to let the land rest for 70 years until he brought them back. But it wasn't just because the land needed rest. It was because of their sin. Now watch 2 Chronicles 36, starting at verse 15. We probably won't hit every verse in this passage just for the sake of time. Verse 15, and the Lord God of their fathers sent warnings to them by his messengers, rising up early and sending them, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. God sent prophets to warn the people these bad things will happen. He just didn't tell them one time and then I was done. He kept sending prophets to warn them. That's why we have the major prophets and the minor prophets in the Old Testament. That's why you have the non-writing prophets like Elijah and Elisha and Micaiah. That's why you have these prophets. They went to warn Jerusalem, you're not following the way God planned out. Now he's going to have to punish you if you don't change your ways. He kept sending warnings. Verse 16. But they mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, till there was, this is chilling, till there was no remedy. God became so angry there wasn't any remedy, and his justice set forth that he had to destroy as he said he would destroy. Verse 17a. Therefore he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of the sanctuary, and had no compassion on the young man or virgin, on the aged or the weak. He gave them all into his hand. And verse 18 tells about how he took the articles of gold. Verse 19, how they burned the city and the temple. Verse 20, how he carried away captives to Babylon, and they became his servants until the rule of Persia came in. And then verse 21 tells us, this was all to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. As long as she lay desolate, she kept the Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. And then the last two verses of this passage tell us how Cyrus became king of Persia, and he allowed the Jews to go back home. So they were rejected when they became idolatrous, but they had a reprieve. And that reprieve was because they'd not gotten to the purpose of their nation yet. The Jewish nation came into existence for one purpose: to get us to Jesus Christ after centuries and centuries of genealogy and prophecies. Therefore, there was that reprieve. But then Jesus Christ came. Jesus Christ lived. And Jesus Christ worked miracles, taught things. Yet still the religious leaders, the Jewish leaders who knew the law, who knew the prophets, who knew the writings, who should have known better, still rejected him. And therefore, he said, that all those rejections, he's not taking away from the fact that everybody would be responsible individually, but nationally, all those rejections of God would come to fruition on this generation. He says that in Matthew 23, verse 36. Assuredly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. They had admitted implicitly that they were sons of those who killed the prophets. They had admitted explicitly that they did not like the things that Jesus Christ had to say. They were about to call for his crucifixion. They'd already been plotting for it. There were times they already tried to push him off a cliff or to stone him to death, but Jesus passed through the midst of them. All these things will come upon this generation. Now, knowing that, the disciples asked the questions in verses 1, 2, and 3 of Matthew chapter 24. When Jesus went out departed from the temple, his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple, and Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when?" You say all the stones are going to be thrown down? When? When will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? They're asking two separate questions, but they don't know it. If you were going to mark in your Bible, you could put a mark between the words be and in verse 3. Tell us, when will these things be, / that's question number 1. And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? That's really question number 2 with 2 parts. The same thing. The sign of Christ's coming and the end of the age. Those questions are answered in 2 parts in verse 24, or chapter 24, with a dividing line that is very key. If you'll skip over to Matthew 24, verse 35 real quickly, watch what he says. Or verse 34 rather, Matthew 24, verse 34. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. He's talking about the first question in the destruction of Jerusalem. He's talking about the things he said in verses 1 through 33. Those things would take place during that generation. A generation is about 40 years. He's speaking those words in about AD 30. Jerusalem would be destroyed in about AD 70. The intervening verses tell us about what would happen leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem. Now let's watch and see what would happen. First of all, there would be destruction in disasters, like there always are in the history of the world. Notice how he says it in verse 4. And Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many." Well, I don't have this in the notes here, but we'll skip ahead. In verse 11, notice what he says. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And then in verse 23, if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There," do not believe it, for false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. In other words, in the period of 40 years from 30 to 70, there were going to be false messiahs, people claiming to be Jesus Christ, people claiming to be, well, not Jesus Christ, because that was his name as a person, as a human being, but they would claim to be the Christ. They would claim to be false prophets. They'd gather people out of there. The secular historians tell us that there was a whole bunch of that going on during those 4 decades. 2 of them are mentioned in Acts chapter 5 in sacred history, Theudas and Judas of Galilee. One of them is mentioned in Acts chapter 21, verse 38, an Egyptian who led 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness. But there were many, many more than those 3, according to secular history, from the likes of Josephus and Tacitus and Eusebius, who rose up and tried to lead people against the Roman armies and against the authorities that were, so that they could recapture their glorious independence in their eyes. But all those false Christs were put down. Christ predicted those false Christs. Then he predicted disasters. Verse 6, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." Well, first let's talk about war in general. Has there ever been a generation without war? Has there ever been a generation that didn't have a war somewhere on the globe? Some people here fought in Vietnam. Some people a little bit older than us fought in Korea. Some people a little older than that fought in World War II. 20 years before that was World War I. Some people here might have been in Desert Storm in the 1990s, might have been in Afghanistan in the 2010s. There's war all the time. Jesus says, don't let that trouble you. That's not the end. Was there war between 30 and 70 AD? Oh, there sure was. As I mentioned before, some historians that are writing nowadays tell us that there's not a lot of historical documents about any place else or anything else during that period of the first century, but there is a whole lot about the wars that took place. Perhaps God providentially made sure those historians recorded about those wars to verify these prophecies that Jesus said would come. There were wars with Rome. There was Rome expanding its borders and going out and pressing its way everywhere. There were always wars. Every generation of soldiers that would come up would have to fight. There were civil wars in Jerusalem. In the 3.5-year siege that came on them before the destruction in AD 70, there were civil wars inside the walls, where these different tribes, these different factions, you might think of the tribal leaders in third world countries today, where these different tribes would actually go and burn the grain supply of another tribe, and that helped contribute to the famine that they suffered inside the walls. In AD 69, there were 3 different Roman emperors, all taken down by assassination preceded by civil war, all in 1 year. There would be wars and rumors of wars. The end is not yet, he said. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines. There was a famine mentioned in Acts chapter 11, verses 27 and 28. The prophet Agabus said that it would come during the days of Claudius Caesar. Claudius ruled from 41 to 54 AD, and there was famine after famine after famine during his time. You know what comes after famine? Pestilence, disease, because people aren't getting the right kind of nutrition. There were all kinds of diseases that were taking place in that time, all kinds of pandemics, if you will, that were taking place between AD 30 and AD 70. And there were earthquakes. There was a preponderance of earthquakes. You might be able to say there are earthquakes all the time. I read where there are a whole bunch of earthquakes even nowadays, but so many of them are in such unpopulated areas that they're just not reported to us. The seismic scale, the Richter scale and the seismic activity is measured, and they're just not reported to us now. But back then there were a whole lot of earthquakes that destroyed a whole lot of places. There were hurricanes, there were disasters that were going on, and Jesus said these things are going to take place. The city of Laodicea, to whom John writes Jesus' words in Revelation chapter 3 about them being lukewarm, was destroyed in AD 62 by an earthquake, just one of many. All these would precede the destruction of Jerusalem. Then, in verses 9 through 14, Jesus warns them that there will be persecution in that time period. They will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended, will betray one another, and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. What happened during 30 to 70? Read the book of Acts. Sacred history tells us there was a whole lot of persecution that came against the church. Jesus had warned in John 16 that they would take him up and want to kill them in the synagogues. Jesus had that happen to him through Saul. He said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Saul said, who are you, Lord? He said, I am Jesus whom you're persecuting. It's hard for you to kick against the goads, in Acts chapter 9. In Acts chapter 8, the Jews had been driven out of Jerusalem, mainly, we think, because the Christians had been, in their minds, raising such a ruckus, and so the disciples went everywhere preaching the word. There was the stoning of Stephen in Acts chapter 7. There was the killing of the apostle James in Acts chapter 12. There was the imprisonment of the apostles back in Acts chapter 4 and 5. There was the imprisonment of Paul in Acts chapter 16. There was all kinds of persecution that was going on against Christians all over the world. First from the Jewish authorities, later, during the reign of Nero, from the Roman authorities. These words came true. And Jesus said, the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world before the end would come. You know it was? The book of Romans was written probably about the mid-50s, and it says that their faith was proclaimed throughout the world. Romans chapter 1, verse 8. Colossians chapter 1, verse 6 has a like allusion, and then Colossians chapter 1, verse 23, Paul speaks of the gospel that he preached, which was preached to every creature under heaven. By 52, 55, somewhere in there, the gospel had gotten to all the world as they knew it at that time. And so verse 14 was fulfilled, and Jerusalem could be destroyed, since Jesus said that preaching of the gospel would take place after that. Then, after telling them about persecution in his proclamation, in their proclamation of the gospel, he tells them how to escape from this desolation. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand the abomination of desolation. Well, the Gospel of Matthew was written primarily to Jewish people who would have understood that reference from three passages in their writings. Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27 gives a time frame for when the Christ would come to earth to fulfill his ministry this first time. That time frame included 490 weeks or 490 years, and that time frame would be up until a time of the abomination of desolation. But then that wouldn't be the first time there was an abomination of desolation, because Daniel chapter 11 spoke of a time when Jerusalem would be desolate before that. They would become desolate because somebody would come in and take away the daily sacrifices and kill everybody that tried to live a Jewish life. From history, we know that was Antiochus Epiphanes in the 100s BC. And then chapter 12, verse 11 refers to the same thing. Well, when these Jews in AD 70 would hear the abomination of desolation, that'd be like us hearing the name George Washington. They're only 200 and some years removed from when that took place with Antiochus Epiphanes, the king of Syria, against their forefathers. We're only 250 years removed from George Washington. They'd know what that meant. The Gospel of Luke was not written to Jewish people, and so Luke takes it upon himself to explain that a little bit. He's writing down the words of the Lord. The Lord would have said all these words. Different portions of them are recorded in the different Gospels by different Gospel writers for the purpose of what they had in view originally. In Luke chapter 21, when Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, he says this in verse 20, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near." Well, the Roman armies would come around Jerusalem. There'd be a siege that started in about 67, but then it'd be in earnest about 5 months in 70 AD. This war would take about 5 months to complete and get all of the people out of Jerusalem and everything burned that they wanted burned. The people knew that that was the abomination of desolation. Let the reader understand, Matthew says. Then, when you see that, when you see the armies around there, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, a lot of people say these next few verses are about the second coming of Christ. But keep in mind some plain passages in the Bible that tell us the second coming of Christ will be as a thief in the night. You won't expect it. It'll be in the twinkling of an eye. 2 Peter 3 and 1 Corinthians 15. It'll be just instantaneously. What good does it do to flee to the mountains if the second coming of Christ is in view? What opportunity is there to flee to the mountains if the second coming of Christ is in view? No, he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. When you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, get out of town. He tells them how in verse 17. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. They had a flat top. They had flat top roofs, and you could run from one to the other. I used to do a little bit of that kind of stuff on this alley between Arlington and Mulberry Avenue over here on top of garages. Once I fell off and sprained my ankle, and then I was caught. But they did that sort of thing in Jerusalem, and they could get out of town on top of the houses. Don't go down to take anything out of your house when you see those armies around. Just get out. It's urgent. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. Well, if it's the second coming of Christ, why are you going to need clothes? Your body's going to be changed to be something spiritual. And why would you even consider clothes? Well, don't go back to get your clothes because you don't have time. Get out to the mountains. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. If it's the second coming of Christ, what difference does it make if you're pregnant or nursing babies in those days? It'll be over instantaneously like that. Your child will be taken in all of his or her innocence to be with God, and you will have the destiny that you have determined by whether or not you've been obedient to God. What difference would it make from anyone? But if you're trying to run from armies and you're pregnant, you don't move as fast. And if you're trying to nurse a baby, even in those days, before car seats and straps and all the things that grandparents can inevitably not do, but parents can do, it's hard to travel with an infant. Woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter, harder to travel in winter still, and it was especially then, or on the Sabbath, because they had restrictions of a Sabbath day's journey. Acts chapter 1, verse 12, which ended up to be about 3/4 of a mile, according to tradition. And they wouldn't want to break the Sabbath. These who are listening to Jesus would have that conscientious obligation to not break the Sabbath. So you pray that it doesn't happen on the Sabbath day and you can move freely. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, nor ever shall be. Scoffers mock this verse right here. Was this worse tribulation than the days of the flood of Noah? Was this worse tribulation than the Holocaust when 6 million Jews were killed? Well, I suppose if you go solely by numbers, it wasn't worse, but sometimes numbers don't tell the whole story. One historian tells us that 1,100,000 Jews were killed, even though the city was much smaller, but they were gathered there for a feast when the attack took place. And 97,000 were taken captive. And to illustrate how bad this tribulation was, you have to read on your own. I don't feel comfortable going into the details of it in mixed, polite company on a Sunday morning in worship to God. The horrors that were wreaked on these people in Jerusalem by the Roman soldiers. Some of the things they saw that were done even before they got there because of the famine made the soldiers tremble and step outside to gain their composure. Jesus knew what he was talking about. And unless those days, verse 22, were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. The elect always meant those people who are listening to God. Not those who were chosen individually by God, but those who had the choice and listened to God. Those are the elect. And if it weren't for the elect's sake, those days wouldn't have been shortened. In other words, Jesus says, I'm going to have some sort of mercy. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I've told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he's in the desert. The Christ is out in the desert. Don't go out. Or look, he is in the inner rooms. Do not believe it. And then verse 27, I think, might be possibly the only reference to the real second coming of Christ that's in these 33 verses. By way of contrast, he's not going to be out in the desert at his second coming. He's not going to be in the inner rooms at his second coming. He's going to be everywhere. And it's going to be quick. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. It'll be for the whole earth. It'll be for a global event. Back to Jerusalem. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Well, you know, when you see vultures out on the road, you know something's dead nearby. Jerusalem had shown itself by its sins to be dead, and the vultures were coming in. Some people have even speculated there might be a reference to the Roman army here because their insignia on their banners that they carried before them and their staffs they carried before them was something of a vulture-like eagle. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. You say, now we're talking about the second coming. Well, not necessarily. In Isaiah chapter 13, Babylon is described as falling. When Babylon is described as falling, the prophet says, the constellations aren't going to give their light anymore. The sun will be darkened, and the moon will not be caused to shine. That didn't literally happen, but seemed like it happened when Babylon went out of their glory and splendor. When Elam went out of its glory and splendor, in Isaiah 34 it was predicted that the heavens would be dissolved and the sky would be rolled back as a scroll. It wasn't talking about the second coming of Christ, it was talking about a coming judgment from God on Elam. In Ezekiel chapter 32 you have the same sort of language on Egypt. This is the same sort of language here. They understood apocalyptic literature, we don't. In other words, what he's telling them is, when all this does come, and when it's time that you see the Roman armies there, and when it's time that you have to get out of town, you got to know this. This is the end of the Jewish way of living. The sun will be darkened. The moon will not cause its light to shine. Just like for Babylon, just like for Elam, just like for Egypt. The stars will fall from the heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. That makes it all the more precious that we have, as the Hebrews writer said in chapter 12, verse 28, a kingdom which cannot be shaken. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Well, surely we're talking about the second coming there. And all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. There are some people that thinks he, by way of contrast, takes a jaunt to the second coming there, and I suppose that may be. But I also think a reasonable explanation is this. Read Daniel chapter 7 when you go home. In Daniel chapter 7, there are four kingdoms that arise, represented by different beasts. But then there is the picture of the Ancient of Days with white hair and a glorious throne that is depicted. And then one like the Son of Man coming to the Ancient of Days on the clouds to get his kingdom from every tribe, nation, people, and tongue. It sounds to me like Jesus is saying, the fullness of my first coming will be completed when Jerusalem is destroyed. That which was predicted in Daniel chapter 7. Those Jews would have understood that. Verse 32, a transparency. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, at the doors. And then that key verse. Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Well, some of the Jewish people and some of the premillennialist teachers and some of the Christian authors, supposed Christian authors of our era, tell us that generation there means Jewish race. Now, what good would it do to tell the Jewish race that you'll be around to see the end of the Jewish race? That doesn't make sense, does it? Generation in the Gospel of Matthew always means a period, a set of people born during a particular time period. In Matthew 11, verse 16, Jesus asks, to what shall I liken this generation? Because John came for you, you acted one way. Jesus came for you, you acted another way. He's talking to those people. He says in chapter 12, verses 41 and 42, that the men of Nineveh and the people of Sodom would rise up in judgment against that generation because they had their sins and they were destroyed. But this generation had Jesus, somebody better, and they're not listening to him. He's talking about that generation. In Matthew 23:36, as we noted at the beginning of the lesson, Jesus is talking about that group of people. All those sins of former generations will come upon this generation. Jesus is telling these people who are listening to him, your generation will not be done till all these things take place. Now granted, if you're 20 years old here, you'd be 60 by the time those things took place. If you're 10 years old here, you'd be 50 by the time those things took place. If you're 30, you'd be 70. If you're 40, you'd be 80. But that generation would see those things. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. That's all the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. What does it matter to me? First of all, the nature of God is that when he has to destroy because of sin, he gives plenty of warning. He kept sending prophets to Jerusalem throughout the years. He kept sending prophets to Judah. He didn't want to have to do this. He's just. He will punish nations, he says. He will punish people everlastingly, he says. He will do this because he has to in his just nature. But he's so loving that he gives plenty of warnings. In this gospel age, we're waiting for the second coming of Christ, and he's giving plenty of warnings. There are slews of Bibles out there. You can download 27 million translations for your phone. I'm exaggerating, and not all those translations that you can download would be good anyway. But you can. The Bible is multitudinous, and there are plenty of warnings, and there are plenty of preachers going out. And there are websites, and there are videos, and there are books, and there are lessons, and there are sermons online. And people are getting warnings. The second coming of Christ will be here someday, unexpectedly. We need to be ready for it. Also, this matters to me because of the correct chronological placement of the signs. Many people take all those signs that we just read, that Jesus said his generation would see, and try to apply them to now. And say, well, it must be now that Christ is coming. And they've been doing this since I was a kid. I remember receiving the book, 88 Reasons That the Rapture Will Occur in 1988. Well, there's no rapture in the Bible. It's only the second coming of Christ. And it didn't occur in 1988 because I'm still here talking to you. And those people who made that calculation changed it to 2011, and those people made it to other, just people move it on. Every prognosticator of time is in error because of what Jesus says in verse 36. But of that day, remember there were two questions? When will these things be, that the temple will be destroyed? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now he gets to the second question. But of that day and hour, no one knows. Not even the angels of heaven. And in Mark chapter 13, verse 32, Jesus said, I won't either, nor the Son, but only my Father. Everybody who says, I know when Christ is coming back, is either deceived or a deceiver. Nobody knows. Nobody with feet on this earth knows. Nobody. The next chapter and a half are devoted to extrapolating what Jesus said in Matthew 24, verse 36. Maybe, Lord willing, we'll look at that next week. All that we have time to notice today is that the Lord is returning, and there won't be signs. It'll be like a thief in the night. It'll be in the twinkling of an eye, and then there'll be immediate judgment. And the question is whether or not I'll be ready for it. I need to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and I need to live by that belief. I need to confess Him. I need to repent of my sins. I need to be baptized for the remission of my sins. Everybody needs to do those things to get started on the life of using their time, their talents, for their obedience to Christ throughout their lives. And then that way, they can be confidently prepared for if the Lord should come. If you've been unfaithful, or if you need to be baptized into Christ this morning, would you please come as we stand and sing?
Just waiting.